They thought you were fragile because they perceived you as solid and composed. They assumed that when things were difficult, you would seek solace in security and comfort. They failed to see that you weren't in need of rescue. They should have been on the lookout for you. You chose not to take cover when the storm eventually arrived. You turned into the storm. While everyone else frantically tried to get away from the mayhem, you maintained a fixed gaze on the horizon. You weren't trembling. You were changing the mood. You accomplished more than simply survive the storm. You confronted it head-on, transforming every difficulty, hurdle, and moment of uncertainty into the motivation that kept you moving ahead. You didn't fold. You grew. Because they saw you during your quiet times, they believed they grasped your power. They witnessed your composure, patience, and quiet way of going about your life. However, they failed to see the fire that was simmering within of you. You were not only waiting for the situation to calm down, the time has come for you to shock the ground underneath them. And it wasn't merely a shift when you eventually relocated. A full-scale change occurred. People are left wondering how they missed it, and the type of shift that upends foundations redefines boundaries. It wasn't necessary to protect you. They ought to have been defending themselves against you. Because nothing is unaffected when you appear like the storm. They are now left standing in the aftermath, having discovered that they were never fully aware of your might until it was too late. Number 11. You wanted altars, they wanted applause. They desired a round of applause. They desired the spotlight, the sudden satisfaction of praise, and the fleeting recognition that comes and goes. They yearned for approbation, as if it were the only thing that could satisfy their inner emptiness. They believed that the claps, likes, and rapid shout-outs were the best indicators of their value, so they pursued them. You, however, weren't seeking the fleeting rush of attention. You were constructing something that would endure. You were working on something far more worthwhile while they were wasting their energy trying to get acceptance. You didn't require immediate attention from the throng. You didn't need cheers to prove that you were real. You were creating a legacy that would endure beyond the commotion and be worthy of respect. You weren't only striving for fame and fortune. You were creating meaning, putting your entire being into something that would not be forgotten or disregarded. You had no desire to be the newest fad or short-lived celebrity. You were too preoccupied with the important things, the depth, the effect, and the influence. When they were accumulating small victories, you were setting the groundwork for a huge undertaking, something that would reverberate long after the cheers had subsided. You had no intention of becoming well-known. You were turning into a myth. And the existence of legends is not confirmed by applause. They endure because they created something tangible and indisputable. Therefore, you were starting movements while they were searching for adherents. When they were pursuing short-lived stardom, you were establishing your historical legacy. The difference currently is evident. They no longer get the acclaim they so desperately sought. What you created, however, endures forever. You become who you are without the approval of others. You grew into something far greater than that. 12. They used broken rulers to measure you. They attempted to define you according to their own constraints by measuring you with broken rulers. They viewed your potential through the limited prism of their preconceptions and experiences, as if all you were capable of could be found in their little universe. They believed that your vision, ambition, and drive were too great for them to understand. They thus made an effort to confine you, categorize you, and utilize their standards to make you smaller. They believed that by classifying you, they might govern you, but since you were never intended to fit into their flawed measures, they were unable to see the whole picture. You weren't made to fit their size. They couldn't really comprehend you, because their expectations were too low, their perspective was too constrained, and their comprehension was too superficial. You didn't need their approval, and you weren't following their rules. You were made to transcend what people believed was possible, to exist in places they were unaware existed, and to smash down barriers. In reality, you didn't fit into their framework because you were designed to break it, despite their attempts to limit you with their preconceptions. It was like attempting to use a compass to catch the cosmos when they tried to measure you. Not possible. Your ambition, vision, and spirit were always too big for their narrow-minded perspectives. You were created outside of their comfort zones and beyond their understanding. And they didn't realize that you were breaking free from every box they attempted to put you in while they were busy attempting to draw boundaries around you. Their constrained definition of success and their flawed standards of what is feasible were never intended to define you. You live in an area that is inaccessible to them, where their boundaries and rulers are meaningless. They are now forced to wonder how they could have ever undervalued someone who was bound to surpass their wildest expectations. 13. The seed was ridiculed, yet you turned into the forest. Since they believed the seed was too little to be anything, they made fun of it. They mocked your modest origins and the notion that anything so small could possibly become something important. Only the dirt, the uncertainty, and the silent times when nothing seemed to be occurring were visible to them. However, they failed to see that progress doesn't have to be conspicuous. Time is necessary. They were unaware that roots silently grow far below the surface, where no one can observe the labor being done. Trees as well. To climb, they don't require approval. While the seed made them chuckle, no one could notice the hard work you were doing. You knew something that they didn't, therefore you didn't have to prove anything. Growth is frequently a silent process. You were constructing something that was not yet visible, something that needed to be tended to in the dark before it could reach the light. They were unable to comprehend how you could continue when the outcomes were mediocre. They were unable to understand your resolve, notwithstanding the absence of praise or acknowledgement. They were unaware that with each setback, uncertainty, and quiet time, your roots were becoming stronger. You weren't in a hurry to get noticed. You were getting ready to take a stand. And then, suddenly, one day, rose, what was previously dismissed as unimportant, turned into something that could not be shaken. The seed they scoffed at became a forest that they must now navigate rather than stomp. The beauty of the silent fight was lost on them. They are now left to gaze at the strength they believed was unattainable, pondering how they failed to anticipate it. Because you never intended to disprove them in the first place, you were just turning into something they couldn't have predicted. A presence that arose without praise, a power that grew without approval. You're standing tall now, creating a shadow. They will never get away. 14. Without realizing you were the flame, they attempted to extinguish you. They attempted to dull you because they believed that if they extinguished the light surrounding you, you would become weaker and go into the shadows like everyone else. They believed that in order to shine, you required approval, acknowledgement, or praise from others. They believed they could put out your flame by putting barriers in your way, restricting your prospects, or stifling your voice. They didn't realize, however, that the light they were attempting to steal wasn't yours in the first place. What was already burning within of you was reflected in it. You didn't borrow your fire from anyone. It came from inside. It wasn't reliant on other people's praise, a crowd's cheers, or the acknowledgement of those who couldn't even perceive how powerful you were. It originated from a depth that was inaccessible, an uncontrollable source, a fire that their efforts to weaken you would not put out. They believed that your passion and purpose would wane if they cut off your sources of support, sapped your vitality, or left you feeling uncertain. They were unaware that genuine fire does not require kindling. It makes its own. Your inner strength stemmed from your conviction that the fire they couldn't see would only become hotter despite their best efforts to impede your way. They are now in front of an object. They weren't ready for it. They are being blinded by the light they believed they could suppress. They haven't only managed to keep your spark alive. They could never have predicted how brilliantly it would blaze. They are now left in amazement as something they never comprehended keeps burning fiercely, unapologetically, and unstoppably. They never believed they could blow out your flame. The problem with folks who have experienced actual suffering is that they are difficult to fold. You are not intimidated by resistance. You're reminded. Reminds you that pressure is a necessary part of progress. The bruises that accompany that breakthrough are always so protected that they don't gleam like diamonds. The reason they gleam is because they survived the fire intact. They're observing your movements differently now. You're not weak. You've been forged. You were only formed by the things that were intended to shatter you. Your presence was made heavier by the strain that was meant to crush you, and those who believed you were incapable of managing it. They're silent now, perplexed by your continued stance. However, that's because they were unaware of it. There is no strain on you. Under it, you perform. 6th place. They muttered about you in the hopes that you wouldn't say anything. Confident that you wouldn't answer, they murmured about you behind closed doors. They subtly disparaged you, sure that you wouldn't speak, and spread your name like rumors were money. They saw your quiet as a sign of weakness, that you lacked the guts to confront them or the bravery to defend yourself. They couldn't have been more mistaken. Silence appeared to be a sign of surrender. They were unaware that your quiet was not a sign of fear. It was concentration. Because you were unaware of what was going on, you weren't keeping silent. You were well aware of their actions. You just didn't recoil. You were observing their movements, what they stated, to whom they addressed it. You did not respond while you took notes. For those that are long-term oriented, they don't waste time on every rumor. You were always informed. As they ran their tongues, you were just 2 steps ahead. As they formed chatter-filled rings, you practiced your motions. You laid the groundwork. They believed you were stuck, but in reality, you were silently preparing for your next level. You also didn't have to explain anything when it came time to talk. You allowed your advancement to be heard over their trivial tales. They were rattled by that. You haven't played the game. They attempted to pull you in. You didn't participate. You rose. You failed to return the clap. You advanced in level. Nothing hurts more than seeing someone you mistrust advance without having to ruin you to do it. And suddenly the same people who had been whispering about you were choking on their own words. Your quiet was a tactic, but they assumed it was a sign of submission. Furthermore, you shown your strength without having to yell. All you needed was time. Now that the roles have been reversed, your development is more noticeable than their rumors ever were. 7th place. You were handled like a pawn by them. You made a royal movement. You were handled like a pawn by them, such as someone who may be pushed, utilized, or sacrificed in order to further their own agenda. They believed you lacked the understanding and will to take charge of your own destiny. They assumed you were giving them permission each time you shown tolerance. They assumed that you didn't know how to breach the rules because you always observed them. They thought you were secure, dependable, and controllable. They were unaware that you were never playing their game, though. You were looking at the board. By giving you tokens of approval, they attempted to keep you in a fixed place and prevent you from seeing the true power you have. They made sure you remained by giving you little positions, little duties, and little rewards tiny. However, you were learning how to move covertly, where the traps were, and who the actual participants were while you watched how the game operated. You then made your move right when they believed they had you figured out. The one that changed everything. The one they didn't anticipate. It was not dramatic, nor was it loud. It was exact, calculated, and indisputable. You didn't request the throne. By outwitting those who attempted to contain you, you took the crown. They were shaken by that. Assuming you would always be 2 steps behind, they constructed their plans. You didn't just catch up, though. You completely reversed the plan. Their aspirations were crushed, and they lost control. The same individuals who attempted to manipulate you like a piece on their board are suddenly acknowledging that you were the player and never the piece. Because you recognize the need of patience, the strength of observation, and the consequences of a well-timed choice, you moved like a king. Now for the game. They believed they were winning. It's already finished. Checkmate. The 8th number. They wager on your lack of confidence. You intensified your self-made triumph. They wager on your vulnerability as if it were a given. They could see the rifts in your self-esteem and the scars you hadn't quite recovered from. They also utilized them as points of entrance. They understood just how to make you doubt your value, where to prod, and what to say. Not all the time was it noisy. You were made to feel insignificant by the little jabs, the veiled analogies, and the phony support. Because they didn't have to worry about you turning into a danger as long as you didn't believe in yourself. They wanted you to remain mired in self-doubt and questioning everything you did. They performed mind games in the hopes that your pain would serve their purposes and that your background would keep you submissive, silent, and uncertain. However, they were unaware that you were more than simply injured. You were awakening. Your insecurities weren't ignored. You looked them down. You dug deep, confronted the unpleasant realities, and performed the difficult inner work that most people avoid. You learned how to disarm your triggers rather than avoiding them. You accepted your imperfections rather than trying to hide them. You began making your own decisions instead of letting fear dictate them. Even when it felt impossible, even when it hurt. Everything altered with that transition. You weren't made flawless, you gained strength. Because being fearless does not equate to self-mastery. It indicates that fear is no longer in charge. You can no longer be touched by those who formerly used shame and fear to control you. Their techniques ceased working, but not because they gave up trying. You outgrown their strategies. Their version of you was outgrown. And you are untouchable because of that. Not just your development, but also your consciousness. Now you are aware of who you are. You are aware of what you are carrying. Nothing they say, presume, or try to change that. They placed a wager on your insecurity, but you used your suffering to gain influence. They never prepared for the version of you that they are now confronting. The person who not only makes it through, but also takes control of room 9. Since you came from nothing, they assumed you would settle. Since you came from nothing, they assumed you would settle. They believed that since you had modest origins, your dreams would also be modest. They assumed that by keeping you confined, you would be happy to barely make ends meet after observing your difficulties and disappointments. They believed you would simply survive rather than flourish, that you would accept the hand you were dealt. They thought they could forecast your future based on your circumstances. However, they failed to realize that after you've already been stared down, those who have nothing to lose don't follow the same rules. Failure persevered through the most trying times and battled for every inch. Your fear changes. If things don't work out, you no longer fear what could occur. You're more terrified of what may occur if you don't give it a go. Beginning again. Someone who has previously had to start again doesn't find it frightening. Indeed, it nearly becomes consoling. Failure doesn't scare you. You fear becoming complacent. You're worried of being overly at ease in the midst. After you have experienced what it's like to struggle your way to the top, they assumed that since you weren't given everything, you would be content with less. Therefore, they misjudged your appetite. When you've had nothing, they didn't understand that. Your goal is to surpass rather than merely succeed. They believed you would like the crumbs, but you didn't want them. You intended to alter the menu as a whole. Therefore, you gambled on yourself while they played it safe and held on to what they already had. You utilized what you learned from having nothing as fuel, pushed limits, and took chances. The same individuals who believed you would barely make ends meet are now seeing you as you create something that is much beyond their understanding. You weren't attempting to survive after all. You were attempting to change, and they will never comprehend that game. 10th, they were unaware that you were the storm rather than the refuge. They believed you to be the refuge, the secure location for storm shelter. They believed that you were the one in need of defense, the person who would break under duress, the person who was incapable of managing the turmoil life was about to provide. Bring your soul to life. Selected ones, don't undervalue those who are silent. All they're doing is loading the footage quietly. Here's the reality, so let that settle for a moment. Some interpreted your quiet as capitulation, your patience as weakness, and your composure as ignorance. They believed you to be naive, as if you were just barefooted, defenseless, and unconcerned as you navigated life on a battlefield. They were unaware, however, that you were observing, not sleeping, learning, not losing, making plans, and not stopping. And you didn't just clap back when it was time to move. You created a whole freaking success symphony. Here's something to consider. Psychological studies show that those who are underappreciated tend to be the most inventive and resilient because they learn to flourish in the background while others squander time in the spotlight. Therefore, you didn't just disprove them when the time came. They now regret ever counting you out because of you. This is for those who have been chosen. They lied to, questioned, and disregarded the people they played with, believing that you were too kind, and too far behind to ever be important. But you made dominance out of that miscalculation. They're now observing like concert goers. They are unable to pay for front-row tickets to greet your era. Let's discuss how you demonstrated your authority to them. First of all, they interpreted generosity as weakness. They thought you were weak because you were kind. They observed your composure, patience, and deference. They also believed it indicated a lack of a backbone. They thought you wouldn't say anything, never take a stand, never defend yourself. They interpreted your quiet as dread. You were gentle because of your empathy. Additionally, you might be treated as a welcome mat because of your forgiveness. However, they made a mistake. Absolutely incorrect. They failed to realize that your silence wasn't a result of fear. You were observing, which is why you remained silent. You were strategic. You were being taught how they shifted, how they were dishonest, the way they twisted things. While they were writing you off, you were keeping receipts. You see, true power doesn't yell. It waits. It gets sharper. Before completely upending the game, it allows people to express who they truly are. Being kind is a kind of control, not weakness. It's having the ability to destroy, yet deciding against it. It's realizing your value without having to make noise to show it. However, this does not imply that you will not react when boundaries are breached. And you didn't merely respond when you did. You reminded me. You emphasized to them that loyalty must be earned, that respect is necessary, and that playing you was the worst thing they could have done. In the hopes that you would play along like a novice, they attempted to test you with games. However, you were getting ready for elevation while they were performing for attention. Silently, you were strengthening yourself, and you didn't blow up when it was time. You did it. No show, no warnings, just outcomes that were more powerful than any phony apology could possibly be. They believed you to be the weak one. You were the storm lurking in plain sight, it turns out. They are now in disbelief. They never thought someone they undervalued would get to that level, not because you changed. But when people mistake calm for inactivity, that's what occurs. You weren't helpless. You would simply wait. Second, they gave you uncertainty in the hopes that you would go hungry. They gave you uncertainty in the hopes that it would shatter you. They were aware of your goals, aspirations, and desired outcomes, and they turned it against you rather than in favor of it. They rolled their eyes, snuck in backhanded compliments, and delivered little punches disguised as jokes. When you discussed your objectives, they deliberately caused you to doubt yourself. They understood deep down that you had the potential to become something they couldn't match, control, or explain, not because they didn't trust in you. They used doubt as a weapon, and they used it every day. Fake compassion, tactful remarks, and encouraging counsel that always made you feel smaller. They wanted your dreams to continue. All they needed was for you to have a modest enough dream to remain accessible. Their discomfort stemmed from your potential. They therefore made an effort to keep you at ease with ordinary. However, they failed to anticipate how uncertainty may be transformed into fuel when it is properly digested. You were the uncontrollable flame. They ultimately undervalued you at every stage, believing they could manage, influence, and minimize what they were unable to comprehend. They didn't understand, however, that you weren't made for their constraints, their standards, or their limited definition of success. The same things they believed would shatter you drove you forward, and the weight of their doubts formed you in the furnace of battle. They didn't merely manage to keep you from moving forward. Stronger, smarter, and more unstoppable than they could have ever imagined, you triumphed over them. You didn't require their affirmation, their endorsement, or their cheers. You never wanted to be famous or famous. You were looking for meaning, development, and an enduring legacy. They made an effort to follow their rules, but you completely altered the game. You transformed every slight into drive, every setback into fuel, and every challenge into a chance to succeed. They are now left to watch you become everything they believed they could shatter and everything they believed you couldn't be. Here's the reality, though. They won't acknowledge that you were always meant for more. You were always supposed to be unique and defy expectations, and to make a lasting impression that will be felt long after they are gone. In their game, you were never the pawn. The king was you. The seed was never you. They were too little to see the jungle you were entering. You may now look back at those who attempted to keep you down as you stand in the light that you created for yourself. The people who realized this and had doubts about you. Your strength wasn't created by them. All they did was fuel it. To become who you were always intended to be, you didn't require their consent, validation, or acceptance. Because ultimately, battling them wasn't your biggest strength. It was in being you, and that they will never be able to touch that force. Don't stop here if this struck a chord with you and you sense a fire blazing inside. Take part in the movement. For more videos that support your development, strength, and purpose, subscribe to the channel. Press the like button. If you're prepared to step up, leave a comment explaining how you're becoming the best version of yourself. We value your opinion and would want to hear it. Additionally, share this energy with anybody you know who needs it, because we alter the rules of the game when we rise together. I appreciate you being here. Continue to be unstoppable. Continue to expand. As always, keep in mind that when your light comes from inside, they cannot take it away. They were unaware, however, that you were never attempting to participate in their small production. You were never here to stay in the box that was created for you or to conform to someone else's idea of success. Although they wanted you to adhere to their plan, you had your own plot, one that didn't need you to be quiet, stay safe, or get trapped while they were busy giving you directions. You constructed your own stage. You were determining your mission, rewriting all they believed they knew about you after realizing your power. You didn't request authorization. You didn't hold off on getting clearance. They weren't even argued with by you. You've just begun to build something larger than their entire story. You stepped into a future they couldn't possibly imagine, leaving their screenplay on the table. What's the best part? You made no attempt to establish anything. Everything they claimed you couldn't, you just became. Bridges weren't burned by you. Limits were scorched by you. You were portrayed as the weak one. However, you turned everything upside down and emerged as the force they were not ready for. They are now seeing you from a distance, perplexed as to how the one they disregarded became the template. You were not the persona. The entire time, you were the author. While you continue to create what will happen next, they are now locked in replays. Fourth place, they turned your dreams into a weapon. They turned your dreams into a weapon, the exact things that stoked your enthusiasm and filled your chest with fire. They exerted pressure on them. They just listened long enough to understand your priorities, then they distorted that information to manipulate you. They gave you a phony, encouraging smile when you mentioned your objectives, then made little barbs behind your back. They referred to you as unrealistic. They joked that your vision was unrealistic. They advised you to be realistic, but in reality, they were telling you to keep your head down. They thought you were vulnerable because of your enthusiasm, and they were aware that they wouldn't have to obstruct your progress if they could cause you to question your own aspirations. You would begin to slow down. In order to get you to quit up before the dream ever took root, they played the long game by subtly discouraging you. However, they were unaware that those who are visually impaired do not require approval from others. You weren't simply talking about your dream. You could sense it in your bones. So you continued to appear. You continued to work. You remained hungry, attentive, and up late. You persisted even when others laughed, when it became lonely, and when the effects weren't yet apparent. You've gained momentum now. People are now beginning to take notice. Their jokes are no longer as loud as their quiet, and now the fantasy they ridiculed is becoming real. Because what they referred to as delusions are now beginning to resemble fate. Until it works, vision always appears wild. Until the outcomes speak for themselves. Until the skeptics stop talking, and the same individuals who made fun of you begin to inquire as to how you accomplished it. That's what makes it so beautiful. You made advantage of their skepticism rather than merely surviving it. You are now becoming legacy rather than merely pursuing it. They believed that your dream was a sign of weakness. It was your weapon, it turns out. The fifth. They believed that the first hint of opposition would cause you to break. They believed that you would fold the moment. Life became difficult. They anticipated you to panic, give up, and leave the instant you encountered opposition. When things were simple, they thought you were strong. They took your self-assurance for comfort when they saw it, not understanding that it had been forged during storms they had never even experienced. You reached out to them. You appeared too composed and unconcerned to deal with actual strain. However, they were unaware that you were a natural part of it. The quiet fights were invisible to them. You've already made it through the mental battles, the sleepless nights, and the mornings when you got out of bed. They were blind to the times. Your entire world seemed to be collapsing, but you arrived smiling. Because they evaluated your strength based on appearance rather than scars, they assumed you would disintegrate when life dealt you a blow. But you activated rather than broke when the pressure came. You began to become indisputable and gave up on attempting to be understood. You were focused by the exact pressure they believed would destroy you. It removed the uncertainty, the fear, and the weakness, leaving behind something stronger and more piercing.